My name is Frances Hasso, and I'm the director of the International Comparative Studies program at Duke. I am delighted to welcome all of you to the ICS annual lecture. What I'll do is I'll begin by sharing a brief message from Dean of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Religion, Lori Patton, who couldn't attend tonight because of a university obligation. And then after I read her remarks, I'll follow with my own remarks. So this is from Dean Patton, colleagues and friends of the ICS program at Duke University. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the International Comparative Studies annual lecture. I believe there is a new reason for international study at universities. In the second decade of the 21st century, we should be pursuing a form of inquiry based not on the usual topics of nations and governmental interests, but rather based on the larger framework of our rapidly expanding interdependencies. And those interdependencies are both old, including trade, diplomacy, energy, currency, and new, internet security, market volatility, environmental health, and well-being. And precisely because cultures and nations and peoples and neighborhoods and religions and armies overlap in ways that we never anticipated, there is all the more reason for study in which the silos are broken down and we look at present as well as historical patterns of interaction across any number of different boundaries. Indeed, Duke is especially interested in the study of boundaries and has created an entire humanities lab on this very topic of boundaries and walls. Under the leadership, okay, this is the awkward part, but she wanted it. Under the leadership of Frances Hasso, that's me, I hope we will move forward with a reinvigorated program in this form of inquiry within ICS. There is a reason why it is one of the most popular majors at Duke. In addition to its vitality and its ability to engage students in transnational and international questions, ICS also provides a key space to think critically about the idea of the global, what it is not, and how it is both used and abused as a concept. And to think critically about the idea of the global is a key 21st century skill that liberal arts institutions should be uniquely positioned to teach 21st century students. I'm going to skip this line about my leadership. In his work on political economy, transnational studies, global governance, civil society, human security, and sustainable development, there is no better person than Sanjeev Khagram to help Duke bring ICS to its next stage of development. As a scholar of India, this is Dean Patton, as a scholar of India, which has been tragically affected by the building of hydraulic systems, I am particularly impressed by Dr. Khagram's work on dams and their local as well as transnational interactions with a wide variety of human and natural networks. And then she asks that you join her in welcoming Sanjeev Khagram to Duke and in our happy anticipation of all the wisdom he can bring to our common global efforts. Okay, so that's unquote, Dean Lori Patton. So now, before I add my own remarks and introduce Sanjeev, I'd like to acknowledge that this event has been generously co-sponsored by the Duke Department of African and African American Studies, the Asian Middle East Studies Program, the Department of Cultural Anthropology, the Dean of Humanities, the Dean of Social Sciences, the Economics Department, the Literature Program, the Office of Global Strategies and Programs, the Office of the Provost, the Sociology Department, I'm almost done, the South Asian Studies Program, and the Women's Studies Program. We are all grateful to them for their support of ICS and this event. And I'd also just like to thank ICS faculty members Sherry Ross, Robin Kirk, Marcy Lytle, and David Need, as well as ICS staff members Lisa Poteet and Kara Clark. Finally, I'd like to thank the Duke ICS undergrad students, many of whom are attending today and have read actually Professor Khagram's work in courses this academic year last and engaged with him and his work today in a seminar and in a lunch meeting. Because we structured around it. So just a little bit here from me. I fully paid attention to Sanjeev Khagram's work as I prepared to take on leadership and teaching responsibilities in ICS last year. I find a number of ideas that have emerged from his work particularly compelling and important to share with students, including his insistence on a constructivist understanding that sees transnational outcomes in economic, environmental, political, and social realms as contingent on a variety of factors that include human action on many scales, rather than predetermined by essentialist understandings of human nature or identity or the market or the state or culture. In this view, politics, history, and the social and cultural aspects of life are under regular construction and reconstruction in a variety of possible directions. Thus, our actions and non-actions make a difference. Such a perspective encourages us to engage with each other and our social and ecological context in innovative and sustainable ways, rather than cynically disengaging or cynically engaging, thereby reproducing destructive dynamics. As a social movement scholar, I find his work on mobilization and transnational coalitions of environmental, labor, indigenous, and women's groups working on many different scales and guided by normative visions of public participation, political accountability, social equity, and ecological sustainability also compelling. I believe he is uniquely situated to address our current historical moment, especially when one considers as well his experiences working with governments, international and transnational institutions and structures. And so now I'll just introduce him just a little bit more. Sanjeev Khagram is a widely published professor of public affairs and international studies at the University of Washington, and also holds the Ratan Tata Chaired Visiting Professor in Globalization, Governance, Human Security, and Sustainable Development at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, India. If I make a mistake, he can fix it.
Yeah.
Okay. From 2008 to 2010, he was the Weiss Visiting Scholar at the Harvard Business School's Social Enterprise Initiative. He holds or has held visiting professorships in South Africa, Thailand, Brazil, and Germany. He has previously held faculty positions at Harvard and Stanford. He was selected as a young global leader of the World Economic Forum and was lead author of the UN Secretary General's report, which was titled The Impacts of the Global Economic Crisis on the Poor. This was in 2009. Dr. Khagram is currently lead steward of a social enterprise named iScale GAN Net, and coordinator of the Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency. Instead of taking more time to tell you a bunch more things, and I cut these down, I'm actually going to just say that we'll have time for questions following his presentation today. And of course, there's a reception afterwards. But if you would join me in welcoming Dr. Sanjeev Khagram to do.
Well, I hope I can meet the billing, and I'll certainly try. I mean, it's a beautiful day outside, and certainly for someone who's now residing in Seattle, I have to say, being outside is a draw, but I will try to be as exciting as I can be. And it's an issue that I care deeply about, both, as Francis was saying, you know, my career over the last 20 years has really been going back and forth between the university, the academy, and the world of practice. And oftentimes my colleagues in the university get pretty frustrated with me when I run away and try to do things in the real world. And those people in the real world get a little frustrated with me when I say, I've had enough, I need to go back and think about this and see if I can really figure this out again. But it's been a way that I feel has allowed me to really both learn a lot, hopefully contribute a lot, and try to help make the world a better place. And I think this topic that I'll try to talk about today, I hope you'll see how critical it is to the future of our planet and individual societies across the world. So, you know the title, I'm going to skip that. Over the last 4 or 5 years, there have been a series of major global events. The first, of course, was, not the first, but one, of course, was the global and financial economic crisis that basically erupted around 2008, and arguably, and I think without question, continues to happen today. And here's a map of the effects that it had in terms of changing growth rates around the world. We know what a devastation it had in the United States, but all around the world. And Francis mentioned this report that I wrote for Ban Ki-moon, which was the first report that really tried to document what was happening to the poor and vulnerable around the world from the global financial economic crisis, and it was pretty devastating. And if you think about just at the level of nation states or governments, more than 50 or 60 governments subsequent to the financial crisis, the sort of, when it erupted, as I said, became or are on the brink of bankruptcy as a result of that. So it wasn't just the private financial sector. It very much has a huge impact on governments and states, as we know, not only in the United States, but all around the world. Of course, all of us have been drawn to, many of us, for a whole host of political reasons, but even if you don't empathize or agree with Occupy Wall Street, the tremendous decentralized sort of social movement activity all around the world that continues on and really focusing on challenges in the global political economy and the lack of equity, transparency, and accountability has been a major event over the last few years. The Arab Spring, unprecedented, unexpected, still we're all trying to come to terms with it. When I was mentioning to some students when I was in Davos at the World Economic Forum, when the mobilization was happening in Egypt, this was across that very important week during that period, and it was quite remarkable to me because here you had at the World Economic Forum, global leaders from governments to business to civil society, and it was quite remarkable because at the beginning of the week, when the mobilizations and the protests in Egypt, in this case, not Tunisia, Algeria, but in Egypt, were really starting to take shape and really be quite forceful, the large amount of public opinion at the World Economic Forum was, this is a terrible thing because it's going to lead to instability in the Middle East. By midweek, as the protests continued to grow and the movement built even greater, there was a shift to, is this really going to make it, be effective enough to topple the Mubarak regime? By the end, when Mubarak actually was toppled and the regime changed, everybody was yelling, "Hooray for democracy!" So it was within this 1 week. It would have been great if I could have done a survey, because we would have seen how, as we all know, really global leaders are as much follow the herd as ordinary people do, and it was quite remarkable for me as a kind of sort of anthropologist, ethnographer, watching this happen in the middle of this very powerful gathering of global leaders. And of course, most recently, the Greek debt crisis, which has, again, been a major sort of both symbolic but obviously also empirical event, sort of episode, which has shown how tenuous whatever is going to happen in the global economy in terms of recovery is, and how much events in any particular country around the world can have multiplier effects, global contagion effects, and how all of us, not just other European countries, but all countries in the world can be affected by decision-making within any particular national society. So, what do all of these recent major global events have in common? Well, many things. But what I'd like to focus on the next slide is failures of and demands for increased and improved transparency and accountability. A red thread that I would argue connects all of these global events, and particularly focusing on public fiscal transparency and accountability. And to make that simpler, how does government raise, allocate, and spend public resources, the government budget? And if you think about it, it's a remarkably central fact of human life in any place, in any part of the world, and yet it has been left mostly to ministries of finance and treasury and departments of treasury, leaders and experts about public finance. And in many parts of the world, as I show, parliaments, let alone citizens and civil society organizations, have rarely been involved in actually thinking about and engaging in how are public resources raised, how are they allocated, how are they spent, and to what purposes. So, in fact, over the last 20 years, there's been some dramatic and unexpected changes. You know, global principles of good governance for greater transparency, participation, and accountability have spread. Virtually in every country around the world now, or more than 100, we have freedom of information laws, which was unexpected 10 years ago. In the area that I'm going to be talking about, only after the Asian financial crisis of 1997 did the IMF actually promulgate a code, a global code, international code on fiscal transparency. There's been a devolution around the world of government budget formulation and implementation powers to subnational levels, so decentralization all around the world. There's a spread of new public finance management principles and practices, multi-year budgeting, all sorts of things that many of us, and I didn't really think about until about a decade ago. There's a growth in the number and capacity of civil society organizations demanding transparency, engagement, and accountability around public finances. And there's new international initiatives. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is about transparency and accountability about how mineral resources are spent, wealth from mineral resources. The International Aid Transparency Initiative, which is about transparency around aid flows. And the Open Government Partnership, which is an initiative that was launched by President Obama and the President of Brazil just a year and a half ago, where now 50 governments around the world have made commitments to open government practices. And so we've had quite a dramatic change. So when you think about it, what's underlying this? Well, it's the political economy of public fiscal transparency, participation, and accountability. And if you think about politics, one of the core notions of politics is who gets what, where, and how. So the government budget, public resources, is a central part of all politics. The budget is a core instrument of government, and yet, as I down below, there still is remarkably little academic research on these topics, let alone, and there's lots of public discourse, but real sustained public engagement around government budgets and public resource management is still pretty thin around the world. It's about who's at the table, getting information, making demands, taking decisions, and all the way to ensuring accountability. So, if there's one thing I'd like you to remember, and there's many things I'd like you to remember, but in terms of sort of empirical side, is if you think about a government budget process, there are 8 key steps in any government budget-making process. The first is that there's a pre-budget statement that is developed by the executive. And that pre-budget statement should at least be shared with other ministries and departments of governments, if not more broadly. It sets the broad parameters and priorities that the government expects to achieve through its budget. The second is the executive, the president or the prime minister, along with the Ministry of Finance or Treasury, budget proposal, which presents the government's detailed declaration of policies and priorities for the upcoming budget year, and including specific allocations. The enacted budget is the legal document that actually authorizes the spending of those public resources. Then you have 3 pieces that happen during the year. In-year reports, mid-year reviews, and year-end reports on how that actual public resources are being spent, where they've gone, have they been shifted into other categories, what assumptions have changed, what impacts they're having. At the end of the year, an annual, or shortly after the end of the year, maybe 2 or 3 months, an audit of how was the money actually spent. And finally, a citizen's budget. Because as I said in Francis' class earlier today, most of us are not PhDs in public finance. Government budgets are very thick with lots and lots of detail and lots of technical information. And most of us can't, even if we had the time, actually figure out what's going on with government budgets. So in order to actually disclose information that's useful and potentially to galvanize not only citizen action involvement, but parliamentary legislative involvement, citizens' budgets are really critical. They basically simplify each step of this process. So what an organization called International Budget Partnership, it's an international civil society network, and I'll come back to them in a second, did was to develop an index. Now, as you all know, around the world, there's tons and tons of good governance indices, the Corruption Perceptions Index, the Bribe Payers Index, many. This, I would argue, is one of the best ones we have around. And why is it? It's because it's based on looking on what's in social science we call observables. You can actually observe whether or not did the government actually present the budget to Parliament. It's not based on perceptions. Either they did or they didn't. Did the government produce a citizen's budget and make it publicly and widely available? Either they did or they didn't. And so the Open Budget Index is an index from 0 to 100, and it basically measures to what extent governments have done all 8 of those steps. And the first one was done in 2006, another one was done in 2008, 2010 is basically biannual, the next one will be in 2012, and it presents some really remarkable information that one would not expect. I'm sure in the back you can't see this, but at the very top of the list is South Africa. How many of you would have expected that South Africa would have the most transparent public budgeting system in the world? I don't think many of us. And that has a lot to do, and I'll come back to this, because of the post-apartheid regime and changes that happened there. Okay. Now the next several countries are the ones you would expect: New Zealand, United Kingdom, France, Norway, Sweden, United States. But notice this: the United States is nowhere near. I mean, it's not number 1, and it has a ways to go. And particularly because the United States, actually, the government doesn't publicize a citizen's budget. Right. So in what many would argue the greatest democracy on the planet, we don't get a citizen's budget, which is the core instrument of government. So if you wanted to know really how much we're spending on defense or whatever, you'd have to get it through indirect means. You'd have to look at the public budget itself. You'd have to ask your senator. You'd have to ask the Center on Budget Priorities, which is an independent organization. You wouldn't get that directly from the government. Now, this goes down. Each section shows you sort of different levels of budget transparency in the world, and it goes all the way down to, you know, Equatorial Guinea, Iraq, Algeria, and so forth. There's some interesting ones that I want to just point out, and Afghanistan, 21. Okay, part of what happened in Afghanistan is actually post the invasion and what some might argue U.S. occupation, there actually has been quite a focus on the public budget. And so it went from 0 to 20. And it's actually very easily, it's not very costly in terms of financial costs or even technical capacity to move up this scale pretty quickly. To publish the enacted budget is not very difficult to do. It very much is about norms of who should have this information, that it should be secret or should be open, why, and who should have the power in some sense in terms of decision making around public resources. So some of the key research questions we want to ask is what structural conditions correlate with changes in fiscal transparency and participation? What are the causal mechanisms that we might consider? What are the relationship between changes in transparency and increases in participation? Because on the one hand is the disclosure of the information. The other hand is the engagement and oversight by other key actors, both in government and outside of government. Legislatures and parliaments, audit institutions, ordinary citizens, the media, and so forth. And then what are the consequences of changes in fiscal transparency and participation, particularly for the kinds of things that friends have mentioned that I care deeply about, and I know many of you do: accountability, anti-corruption, resource allocation, equity, development, and sustainability. Because let's go back just for a second. Why is this so important? Because by and large, for many of the things we care about, health, education, social services, environmental protection, the largest pot of resources that goes to this, and still many of us would argue more should go, comes from government budgets. So if we don't know what is in government's budgets, how could we in fact influence what's being spent on, right? So in terms of structural correlates, it's very straightforward. This is a kind of straightforward list that comes from research on democracy and regime change and many other types of political changes in the world. We could imagine economic correlates of increased fiscal transparency, political ones, cultural and historical ones, and international ones. What we try to do, and then we can think about causal mechanisms, elite competition, so incumbents versus opposition. Opposition politicians might come in on a platform of opening up the public budget. Competition or contestation between the executive versus the legislative. If the executive is holding all this information and not providing it to parliamentarians or legislature might increasingly demand that they know because they have a responsibility to the citizens that vote for them. Political versus economic elites. Reformist versus entrenched bureaucrats. Reformist bureaucrats, in the interest of improved public sector management, might see that transparency can improve efficiency and effectiveness of the public sector. Civil society organizations. Crises of different types. They could be financial or fiscal crises that put pressure on governments to open up their books, as in the case of Greece, or corruption scandals that open up reform opportunities. Processes of democratization. So we would expect when you have a transition from an authoritarian to a democratic regime that there's going to be more likely that governments are going to be transparent in terms of public resource spending and allocation. And then international norms and pressure, whether they be through conditionalities or direct investment or market incentives and other types of international norms. In terms of effects and effectiveness, there is at least a somewhat optimistic or sort of normative hypothesis that if we have greater fiscal transparency and greater public participation in public resource decision making, it's going to lead to lower corruption, changed allocations of resources, improved public management, improved processes basically, as well as contribute to substantive outcomes, greater financial stability, equitable allocations of resources, improved service delivery, and so on. So what we've tried to do over the last 5 years is try to be a little bit side, and then I'll come back to the practice side, in understanding what are the causes and consequences of fiscal transparency and participation, and using the Open Budget Index as well as doing in-depth case studies to do statistical analysis, comparative analysis, and in-depth historical case studies to try to tease out some of these relationships. So let me start off with the cross-national and the comparative analysis, statistical and comparative analysis. So we used 2008 Open Budget Index as a measure of fiscal transparency, and we used it because it's independent and comparable and a replicable measure across countries. What we particularly were interested in was, does the political demand for fiscal disclosure make a difference? Do elections, the age of democracy, types of revenue sources, oil or minerals, political competition, and a whole set of control variables that connect back to the correlates I was mentioning before, the level of economic development, whether it was a British or a French or a Portuguese colony. Is it dependent on mineral resources? A whole range of factors that are a typical set that we might say that might be connected to levels of fiscal transparency. And so what we found, and there's an article and an entire edited volume coming out with Brookings Institution Press in July called The Political Economy and Fiscal Transparency that I'm co-editing with some colleagues, and I can send that to Frances and she could share it with others if you're interested, is that, not surprisingly, fiscal transparency is correlated with the level of economic development. So as a country becomes more wealthy, they're likely to be more transparent fiscally. But as importantly, democracy counts very much. So it's not how long you've been a democracy, but once you become a democracy, you have a big bump in how transparent you are, and this is not surprising. Also not surprising is oil dependence has a negative effect. So the more dependent a country is on mineral, particularly oil resources, the less transparent it is. And this fits with all the sort of paradox of plenty types of arguments.
Their own resources.
That's right. No, not imported, internally. But the interesting thing is that if you are you have oil resources internally, and you're a democracy, democracy counteracts the oil dependence. So it's actually authoritarian regimes, oil resource dependent, internally oil resource dependent authoritarian regimes that are particularly problematic. And that political competition among parties enhances budget transparency. And you can imagine why this is. If you're an opposition political party and you're trying to gain power, what is one way that you're going to do that? You're going to be criticizing and wanting to get more information about, therefore, to criticize the party in power. And so the more that you have a robust, competitive political party system, the more likely you're going to get pressures for fiscal transparency. Then we did an interesting study of a subset of 14 countries for which overseas development assistance is greater than 10% of national income. And to what extent do donor and reliance on aid, foreign aid, affect budget transparency scores? And what we found is that there's not much of a relationship. And if you go to the next slide, there's some slides. So over in the first graph, you have overseas development assistance as a percentage of gross national income. And on the horizontal axis, the OBI score, and you see there's basically no relationship. You could be very dependent, higher levels of ODA, and you could have low levels, and lower, and you could have high levels. It's very mixed. But what is true is how donors engage with the countries that they're giving funds to is very critical. So to the extent that donors make aid conditional on budget transparency, you get more transparency. To the extent that donors give not project monies, but public support money, they're more likely to be, the countries are more likely to be transparent. The more extent that the donor monies are coordinated and as opposed to disaggregated, the more likely there's going to be transparency. So there's some interesting ways in which donors can play a role in terms of improving fiscal transparency. But, the next slide, please. There really is limited use of conditionality to push for transparency by and large. Aid fragmentation and the lack of aid transparency goes in the other direction. And the key still drivers are domestic changes, what's happening within the domestic political environment. So what we found looking backwards using the statistical analysis and this comparative analysis is that, again, domestic political factors are key, but with statistical analysis and the kinds of what you can learn from them, it doesn't give you very much nuance about what's going on. In terms of the role of international factors, there doesn't seem to be a major role for them. But I'm going to argue very soon that over time, international factors and actors have become more important. So 20 years ago, not as important. 15 years ago, more important, and now increasingly even more important. And as I said, there's lots of limitations to this sort of statistical analysis, and that's why we need to go deep into countries and look at country trajectories over time. So let me talk about some of the case studies. So over the last 30 years, in Brazil, we've gone from a system which was completely opaque and secretive in terms of government decision-making around public resources to, if we went back to that index, Brazil's in the second tier in the high 70s and quickly moving up. And in the 2012 round, most likely is going to be in the 80s or 90s. So it's become a real leader in fiscal transparency and participation. And for those of you either anecdotally or through papers or you've studied it, participatory budgeting at the local level is one of the innovations that has come out of Brazil. So the question is, why such dramatic gains? And there are several factors. Certainly political democratization during the 70s and 80s was a major part of the shift to more fiscal transparency. but as importantly was macroeconomic restabilization. And this is where I want to start raising some of the contradictions behind the drive for fiscal transparency and accountability. Part of the logic is the democratic logic that leads to increased fiscal transparency, but part of it is very much a market logic. That is to say, countries, governments trying to signal to international markets that they can manage their public resources wisely so that they can get better bond ratings and credit ratings and increase foreign direct investment. So for Brazil, and we'll see for many other countries, one of the major motivations to become more transparent was to be able to both control domestic public spending, the argument being with more transparency there's more pressure to spend less, and two, to send signals that they're good managers of public finances to international players. A third major factor was certainly scandals and crises. There was punctuated moves in fiscal transparency in Brazil that were associated with scandals and crises. Fiscal crises, again, linked to macroeconomic stabilization, leading to reforms and greater fiscal transparency, but particularly also corruption scandals, linked, of course, with democratization and competitive party politics. As many of you know who read about and study Brazil, very strong labor and social movements that led, of course, eventually to the election of Lula in the previous presidential election, and as I mentioned, participatory budgeting and other democratic innovations. But it was over a 30-year period that you had this sort of punctuated improvements in transparency. Now, interestingly, in Brazil, what you get is participatory budgeting at the local level, but less so at the subnational, the state level, or at the federal level. And so what you have here is sort of participation from below and transparency from above. And that's where you are in Brazil now. An interesting innovation in Brazil, though, now, which we don't even have in the United States, is all public budget, the national public budget, is completely online. So anyone can go online and find out what's been allocated to any part of Brazil, any aspect of the budget. And that's pretty remarkable, right? And that's just happened over the last year and a half. South Africa. So why did South Africa become this unbelievable success story on fiscal transparency? Well, of course, it happened as a result of the transition from apartheid and the new democratically elected government regime, the Mandela government, post-1994. But in fact, when one goes deeper into what the motivations and the incentives were, was that when the ANC came to power, there was huge fiscal deficits. And there are fiscal deficits not only at the national level, but at the subnational level. And so the ANC was particularly worried about showing to the international system that they were good, they were going to be a good government, that they were effective managers of public resources, they were not going to be corrupt, that, you know, switching from a basically white-dominated to a black-dominated government wasn't going to lead to the Africanization, the typical Africanization of the South African political system. And so creating a very modern public financial system was very critical and signaling to international markets, because foreign direct investment was, was desired in a major way. The whole model that the South African government adopted at post-1994 was basically a sort of soft neoliberal model, and so this was part of their signaling to the marketplace that they were good financial managers. At the same time, you have the highest level of fiscal transparency in the world and virtually no public participation or parliamentary oversight over the national government in terms of public budgeting. And part of that is we know that there's very little political competition in South Africa. You have basically an ANC-dominated democracy, electoral democracy. So there's not opposition parties pushing hard in parliament. Secondly, civil society was emaciated post-apartheid because most civil society leaders ended up joining the government. And so you don't have pressures from civil society from below. And so what you have is this, and so in some sense, fiscal transparency was a very low-cost action by the South African government because they weren't going to really get held accountable by either opposition political parties or civil society. It was something that they can do with very low political costs, but potentially high economic benefits in terms of foreign direct investment and aid and so forth and so on. Now, more recently, over the last 5 years or so, more civil society groups are using budget information, and TAC, which is the Treatment Action Campaign that works on HIV/AIDS issues and one of the most strongest national social movements in South Africa, is using this budget information. What they have now is a really fascinating new model where folks in Pretoria, the national capital, send information about what should be spent all the way down to the clinic level in townships through SMS to cell phones. TAC operatives or sort of social movement activists at that level are monitoring whether or not those funds are actually being spent. So if there are drug stockouts, if the doctors or the nurses aren't there, you're starting to get an accountability mechanism. That wouldn't have been possible without fiscal transparency, but without the civil society actions, you don't really get the accountability. South Korea is probably the most interesting and positive story. And again, on fiscal transparency, it's as high as Brazil, a little bit higher, but its process, and in many ways its process was similar. Many of you know sort of the democratization process. South Korea achieved a relatively high level of socioeconomic development, then became democratic over time. The key factor here is that unlike Brazil, the folks that were elected in the first 2 or 3 elections in South Korea were leftist political parties, and with strong connections to civil society organizations. So that led to a virtuous cycle of increased fiscal participation, transparency, and participation. Then you had the Asian financial crisis and the international community putting a lot of pressure on East Asian governments to become even more transparent. South Korea instituted the IMF plus reforms on fiscal transparency. And so right now, if you go to South Korea, it's one of the most fiscally transparent public management, financial management systems in the world, and a dramatic amount of civil society and parliamentary participation in budget making, which makes it quite unique. Now, more recently, just to show that this is not sort of something that's teleological, with some more sort of conservative parties, politicians being elected to power, there's been some regression. And so it shows that left political parties in relation to strong civil societies play a very important role in continuing to push forward on fiscal transparency and participation around the world. Mexico is pretty interesting because you would expect more from Mexico, and yet it's sort of stuck in the middle. It's basically around 50 to 60 in the OBI rankings, and the basic factors are this. It's an incomplete democratization process, a pretty weak legislature. The audit institution is not independent at all. There's a pretty cozy relationship between big business and, in this case, oil, Pemex, the oil industry, state-owned oil industry, and the government. And of course, the violence and security challenges has led to the state governments, national governments, making a strong case for keeping public resource issues secret because of trying to deal with violence and so forth and so on. I'm going to skip some of the next ones. I want to go to Vietnam, where basically Vietnam is very low, and not surprisingly, in terms of fiscal transparency, but very recently it started to have a big uptick in fiscal transparency, which was unexpected. And the reason I want to mention Vietnam is to show that it's not only through a democratic or a market-oriented pathway that you can get these reforms. In the case of Vietnam, it's very much because, as I said, the international system has changed. There's more normative international norms around transparency generally and fiscal transparency specifically. And Vietnam very much wants to be known as a country with good governance. It wants to be demonstrate itself as a good model state. And part of that is doing things around fiscal transparency. So there's been some recent reforms that has made the country more open than one would have expected because it's hardly democratic. And it's, it does have an export-oriented model, but it's not really worried, it's not using this as a way to attract more foreign direct investment. In addition, even though there's not very strong civil society organizations in Vietnam, there is very interesting indirect ways that citizens are showing their sort of criticism and displeasure about corruption. And so in a one-party authoritarian state, part of the way legitimacy is provided is by being somewhat responsive to citizen demands. And so fiscal transparency reforms are a way that the Vietnamese government is showing that they're responding to these criticisms around corruption of the state. Next one. The last one I want to talk about is Senegal. There's little improvement relative to expectations given higher level of development and stronger civil society relative to West African neighbors like Mali and other places like that. A major challenge is that most French colonial systems, for a whole host of institutional reasons, they don't have independent audit institutions. It's just a very different model. And despite the fact that France itself has become one of the leaders in fiscal transparency, many former colonies aren't doing very well. There's been successive waves of budget reforms, but that's led to very little improvements in terms of fiscal transparency. And going back to the notion of what donors do, there's a very contradictory role of donors. So donors are very much pushing for transparency, but upward transparency. Tell us, the donors, what you're spending on, not necessarily saying to the Senegalese government, you should make the budget information more transparent and accessible to your own citizens. So on top of that, you have the persistence of a centralized presidential regime. So you don't get much change in Senegal. So I'm going to skip some of, well, let me just say, so if you start to compare across, we can make some provisional conclusions about what's going on in the world. The one, I'm going to skip the first, it's about the OBI and what it captures and what it doesn't. The OBI, not that first dot. The OBI captures a lot, but what happens, and we were talking about this in Francis' class, as countries become more transparent in their formal budget systems, what they do is they start to put more resources off budget. Okay, so a country can become really great, they go to 70 or 80, and you're like, great, they're making such dramatic improvements, but what they do is they take money off the formal budget and allocate it in ways that become secretive. So that's something that happens in any sort of progressive change. There's creative ways to skirt around the new norms of institutions. What the key things we found is that initial reforms are often top-down from political elites, focused on fiscal discipline internally and signaling to international markets and/or donors externally. Democratic transitions and crisis corruption scandals are triggers to reforms. Okay, the next one. Civil society actors, in my previous work on dams and other things like that, I would have made a strong argument that networks of civil society actors made a big difference. Over the initial phase of reforms, in fact, civil society actors haven't had a huge influence. But now things are changing, and I'll come back to that in a second. And there's still not much evidence of the roles of media or supreme audit institutions, except during scandals for media and isolated cases of audit institutions. More increases in transparency, not surprisingly, than actual participation. And so transparency, not surprisingly, doesn't automatically lead to participation. So where are we headed in terms of the future? The current state of affairs. Practices remain a large problem. Improvements are uneven. There's been unexpected advances and innovations, but we have a long way to go. So if you look at those, steps in the budget process, more than 80% of countries around the world don't, publish a citizen's budget. Still, almost 70% don't even publish their pre-budget statement. Almost 30% don't provide their budget proposal to Parliament. You still have lots of problems. And in terms of audit reports, we're still almost more than 40% don't actually publish audit reports. So we have a long way to go, but there has been improvements. There has been a dramatic growth of civil society groups that are focused on budget transparency and accountability around the world. In 1997, there was only 6 civil society groups in basically 6 countries. More than 6, about a dozen civil society groups in 6 countries around the world. Now there's civil society organizations working on budget transparency and accountability issues in 100 countries around the world. So there's a real transformation in terms of civil society capacity and engagement on this issue. There's the International Budget Partnership, which is the transnational network of these civil society groups, and it has offices in Washington, D.C., India, Mexico, and South Africa, and links in a networked way for capacity building, sharing, and learning these civil society groups around the world. And does international level advocacy with major institutions like the IMF and the bank and governments and so forth. Just last year, in November of 2011, a global citizens movement for open, inclusive, and accountable public budgeting was launched, and a declaration of principles was signed by over 100 organizations from around the world. And so there's a big move from below that's happening now that didn't exist 5, 10, or 15 years ago. It's become a major focus of private foundations. The Soros Foundation, Open Society Institute, the Ford Foundation, Gates Foundation, and a whole range of others, DFID, bilateral donors. And so there's much more resources. And there's a thing called the Transparency and Accountability Initiative, which brings together the major foundations along with the major international NGOs like IBP, the International Budget Partnership, Revenue Watch, and others to advance these issues around the world. Most recently, something that I've been actively involved in, we have created a multi-stakeholder global initiative to advance global norms and improve practices for fiscal transparency. And the co-chairs of this are the government of Brazil, the government of the Philippines, the IMF, the World Bank, and the International Budget Partnership. And so at the first time, you've had civil society, governments, international organizations all at the same table pushing for improved global norms and practices around fiscal transparency. So given all this and the recent major political events that I started with, the global economic crisis, the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, the Greek debt crisis, and other issues around government debt around the world, we are at, in my view, a tipping point in terms of global fiscal transparency and participation. We have a long way to go, but considering where we were 15 or 20 years ago, most of us wouldn't have expected this. And again, when you come down to where are the, let's talk about, let me just say 2 last things. A big amount of money is going to go from global north to global south in climate funds, climate adaptation funds. If you don't have government fiscal transparency, most of those resources are going to get wasted either through corruption or mismanagement or misallocation. International aid, just the general tax revenues that ordinary citizens are paying into their governments. If you think about, and this is where I will be pushed on the democracy side, there can be no real democracy without fiscal democracy. And you can't have democracy, fiscal democracy, without increased levels of transparency, oversight by parliaments and legislatures, independent audit institutions, and the active engagement of civil societies. So this is as much a practical policy challenge as a research challenge for all of us as scholars and citizens in the world as anything else, because if we really want to make a dent on many global problems that affect national and global societies, public resource transparency, participation, and accountability is going to be a central and key lever.